Welcome to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we would be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. And now let's move on to our first story. The morning of that day was truly amazing. The sky above the city was shining with a cloudless blue. The sun gently warmed the earth, filling the air with the light warmth of autumn. The trees in the park near Jayden's house had already begun to lose their leaves. Golden and red leaves smoothly swirled in the air, as if deliberately emphasizing the calm of this morning. It seemed that the day promised to be absolutely ordinary. Jayden Williams, a 12-year-old boy with big brown eyes and a mischievous smile, was getting ready for school as usual. His mother, Michelle, had already left for work, leaving him a note and some sandwiches on the kitchen table. Jayden quickly dressed in his school uniform, threw his backpack over his shoulders, and left the house, waving goodbye to his neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, who was tending to her roses in the front yard as usual. Today, Jayden was walking to school alone. His best friend, Carlos, was sick and had to stay home, but this did not upset the boy. He was full of joy and anticipation, a new day ahead, meeting friends, playing during recess, lessons that he enjoyed. The walk to school took him through several streets and a park. Jayden always loved this time of day. Mornings were the time when he could enjoy solitude, listen to music on his headphones, and watch the city go by. Cars rolled slowly down the street, people hurried to work, students to college. Everything was familiar and calm. As usual, he walked, slightly bouncing to the beat of the music, his backpack swinging cheerfully on his back, and a carefree smile on his face. But this day was not like all the previous ones. Around the corner, on one of the quiet streets, there was a police car. Jayden noticed it only out of the corner of his eye. Not paying much attention, Officer Thomas Carter was sitting in his patrol car, watching the street. He had worked in this area for a long time, knew many of the residents, and was accustomed to the routine of daily patrol. But at that moment, his gaze accidentally fell on Jayden, who was crossing the street. Something about the boy's demeanor, or perhaps his appearance, caught the officer's attention. Jayden was black, and despite his school uniform, Carter felt a wave of suspicion. Perhaps it was the bias of years of work, perhaps personal prejudice, but in the officer's mind, the boy in the backpack suddenly seemed like a potential threat. Something made him get out of his car and walk toward Jayden. The boy, immersed in the music, didn't immediately notice the officer approaching him. Only when he heard a shout did Jayden take off his headphones and look back. The policeman, a tall, strong middle-aged man, was slowly approaching, his face serious and wary. Jayden froze, confused. "Where are you going, boy?" The officer's voice was cold and stern. "To school, sir," Jayden answered quietly, not understanding what was happening. He felt confused and a little scared. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just going to class like every day, but something in the officer's tone made him feel like he was already guilty, although he didn't know what. Carter moved closer and the tension in the air began to thicken. Officer Carter walked up to Jayden, looking at him closely. There was dislike in the officer's eyes, as if he was looking for any reason to accuse the boy. Jayden felt his heart begin to beat faster. He didn't understand why the officer was treating him like this. After all, he was just a kid, and he had textbooks in his backpack, not something illegal. "What's in your backpack?" Carter asked sharply, reaching out to the boy's shoulder as if to take the backpack off him. Jayden took a step back, instinctively protecting his belongings, his eyes widening in surprise. He had never been in a situation like this before and didn't know how to react. The officer immediately interpreted this move as resistance. Suspicion flashed in his gaze, which only increased his aggression. "I asked, what's in your backpack? Are you hiding something?" Carter stepped forward, his presence making an impression. "There's only textbooks." Jayden's voice wavered. He felt the situation was getting out of control, but he didn't understand what he did wrong. The policeman, accustomed to crushing the slightest disobedience, grabbed the boy's backpack and yanked it sharply. Jayden wobbled on his feet, not expecting such aggressive behavior. He didn't want his things taken for no reason, but he was afraid to resist. Panic began to take over his mind. Tears began to form in the corners of his eyes, but he fought hard to hold them in, not wanting to appear weak or afraid. He knew that crying would only make the situation worse. "I didn't do anything, please, I'm just going to school." Jayden tried to explain, his voice breaking with fear. But the boy's words only made Carter even angrier. He had worked the streets too long and seen too much crime to trust people, especially those he considered potential criminals. In his eyes, Jayden wasn't just a kid, he was a potential threat that needed to be stopped. Everyone says that until they get caught, Carter said, yanking open his backpack. Books and notebooks fell to the ground, some pages slightly dirty. Jayden looked at it in horror. He was not only scared, but also ashamed. How could this happen? He just wanted to get to school, and now he was standing in the middle of the street like a criminal in front of an indifferent policeman who had rummaged through his things. What kind of behavior is this? Carter continued, his tone becoming more and more threatening. Jayden took another step back, not realizing that it would only increase the officer's aggression. At that moment, an elderly woman who had been watching the scene began to walk past, but she didn't stop, didn't say a word, just took a quick look and continued on her way. She was Jayden's acquaintance from the neighborhood, but even she didn't dare intervene. This only added to the boy's feeling of complete helplessness. "Why are you backing down? You're hiding something, aren't you?" Carter's voice grew harsher, and his hand grabbed Jayden's shoulder. Now the boy couldn't move. He felt the policeman's iron grip squeezing his body, and his inner resistance gave way to horror. What would happen next? He knew that if he didn't stop now, the situation could get even worse. "Let me go!" Jayden tried to shout, but his voice was too quiet and scared. He knew that in this situation his words had no weight. Carter gritted his teeth. He was sure this wasn't just a schoolboy, but someone who might be involved in something bigger. It was a flash, a quick reaction to the escalation of the situation, and then the policeman did something that perhaps no other person would have done. His hand moved sharply, and the blow landed squarely on the boy's side, knocking him off his feet. Jayden fell to the ground, disbelieving what was happening. He felt a sharp pain in his body. His breathing became rapid and ragged. It all happened so fast that his mind simply did not have time to comprehend what had actually happened. Images flashed before his eyes, confused passers-by, a police car, books lying on the pavement. The world suddenly became different. Jayden lay on the pavement, dazed and disoriented. The policeman had hit him harder than he could have imagined, and everything around him seemed to slow down. His ears were ringing, and the world was blurring, as if he were in a nightmare. There was confusion, fear, and a terrifying sense of inevitability in the air. What had started as an innocent question was rapidly spiraling into something sinister and destructive. Officer Carter stood over him, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. His gaze was full of contempt, directed at the boy who, just a few minutes ago, had been walking to school. Jayden tried to push himself up on his elbows, but immediately felt a sharp pain in his side. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he couldn't hold them back. He was sobbing hard, but he tried his best not to let them escape. "Get up, boy," Carter snapped. "You brought this on yourself." The police officer stepped forward and leaned down, grabbing Jayden by the collar of his school uniform. He yanked the boy to his feet with a brutal yank, as if he were nothing more than a sandbag. Jayden felt the fabric of his shirt dig into his neck, making it hard to breathe, and his legs buckled once more. He tried to break free of the tight grip, but it only made Carter even more angry. "You decided to show how smart you are. You think you can resist the police?" Carter hissed through clenched teeth, not letting go of Jayden. Jayden squeezed out, choking from fear and pain. The boy's words were drowned out by the officer's tirade. Carter, ignoring his pleas, threw Jayden back to the ground, causing him to hit the pavement. The dull thud echoed through the boy's body, causing him to scream in pain. He lay on the ground, desperately clutching at his sore rib, feeling it ache and burn from the inside. "Get up," Carter shouted, his voice full of irritation. He was starting to lose control. Jayden tried to rise again, but his body refused to obey. The pain in his side was getting worse. His head was spinning, and his legs were shaking, as if they were about to give out on him completely. In that moment, he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. Carter was not going to calm down. In the officer's eyes, Jayden was not just a child. He was a threat, an object of suppression. "Can't you hear me?" Carter thundered, moving closer to Jayden again, his face becoming even more distorted. When Jayden couldn't get up, the policeman grabbed him by the backpack that was still hanging on one of the boy's shoulders and jerked him up again, forcing him to stand up. But this time the movement was sharp and violent. Jayden gritted his teeth in pain. but he couldn't stop the groan that escaped his lips. Carter threw the backpack aside and pushed Jayden against the wall of the nearest building, his face inches from the boy's. Jayden could feel the officer's hot breath on his skin, his anger and aggression. The officer pressed his hand hard against the boy's chest, squeezing him even more. "Are you still resisting? Do you think you can leave me?" His words were full of malice and hatred. A few people started walking past, some stopping for a moment to watch, but no one dared to intervene. Some took out their phones, filming what was happening, but no one made a move to stop the police officer. Jayden saw their faces, felt their gazes, but no one rushed to his aid. He was completely alone in this nightmare. "Please," he whispered through tears, desperately hoping for some mercy, but there was none. Carter, squeezing his arm viciously, threw Jayden to the ground again, and this time the boy landed on his back. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs, and for a few seconds he simply couldn't breathe. Pain gripped his entire body, and he felt his world begin to blur, as if he was losing consciousness, but fear kept him from falling into the darkness. Suddenly, Jayden felt a sharp tingling sensation in his lower back. It wasn't just painful, it was different, scary. His legs stopped moving. He tried to move them, but they wouldn't obey him, as if his body had suddenly refused to obey. He lay on the cold asphalt, looking at the indifferent sky, and could not understand what had happened to him. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, but fear completely consumed his consciousness. "You should have thought before you started acting like that," Carter growled, looking at the helpless boy. Those bystanders who witnessed the scene began to whisper, and some even tried to call the police or emergency services, but Jayden could no longer hear them. His world was slowly sinking into a fog of pain and horror, and before his eyes there was only the silhouette of the policeman, looming over him like a shadow that destroyed his innocent world. A world that will never be the same again. Lying on the cold pavement, Jayden tried to catch his breath. His chest rose and fell heavily, and the world around him became more and more alien. Every movement caused pain, and he felt like control over his body was slipping away. Just moments ago, he was just a boy walking to school, but now everything was different. He didn't know what would happen next, but fear gripped his mind. Carter stood there, his face cold and full of contempt. It seemed that no emotion or remorse could break through that barrier. He looked at Jayden as if he were another intruder who needed to be brought to his senses. A baton suddenly appeared in the policeman's hands, black, long, with a glossy surface, shining in the autumn sun. It seemed to symbolize the merciless power that Carter was now using. "Get up," he barked again, hitting the asphalt with his baton as if in warning. But Jayden couldn't get up. His legs refused to obey him, and his body didn't respond. He looked at Carter with eyes full of horror, and his voice trembled as he tried to say something. "Please, I can't move." "You're lying," Carter interrupted, his voice laced with anger. "You're just trying to avoid responsibility. Do you think I don't see people like you every day? Get up, or I'll make you do it." But Jayden really couldn't move. Panic was building in his chest, and every word he spoke became quieter and quieter until it was a wheeze. He wanted to scream, but he didn't have the strength. He was paralyzed not only by fear, but also by this strange sensation in his legs that he couldn't quite place. Carter lost his patience, his face twisted into a cruel grimace, and he stepped closer to Jayden. His shadow fell over the boy like a cold blanket, and the officer's face turned furious. He raised the baton above his head, and its gleam flashed one last time before it fell with a dull hiss onto Jayden's body. "Get up," Carter shouted, breaking into a scream, while simultaneously striking. The blow was devastating. The club slammed into the boy's side, and Jayden felt something inside him snap. A scream of pain erupted from his chest, deafening him. His breathing was ragged, and a searing pain he had never felt before shot through his body. Each breath was excruciating, as if his lungs had given up on him. He tried to raise his hand to protect himself, but the second blow caught it squarely. "Aya!" Jayden screamed, his voice echoing down the street. He tried to curl up into a ball to protect himself from the next blow, but Carter wasn't going to stop. "You thought you could resist the law?" Carter continued to yell, each scream followed by another blow. "You think you can do whatever you want?" The club crashed down on the boy's body again and again, on his back, on his legs, on his shoulders. Each blow was harder than the last. Jayden felt his bones crack under the relentless force, and he couldn't stop the screams that tore at his throat. All he wanted was for it to stop, for the pain to end, but Carter didn't stop. "You're nothing but a dirty liar," the officer shouted again, his face now red with rage. "I'll show you how to respect the law." A hard blow landed right on Jayden's lower back. In that moment, everything changed. The boy's legs finally stopped obeying his brain, and a cold wave of horror washed over his consciousness. He couldn't feel them. He couldn't feel anything below his waist anymore. The world became blurry and unclear. There was a ringing in his ears, and for a moment, Jayden thought he was simply losing consciousness. "Please," Jayden croaked, his voice almost inaudible. But Carter didn't hear, or didn't want to hear. He was consumed by his own anger. He continued to hit the boy, each blow full of cruelty and unbridled force. The club in his hands was like an instrument of his rage, which he poured out on this small, helpless body. More and more people passed by. Some simply stopped, filming the scene on their phones. Others nervously looked away, unsure of how to react. There were even those who whispered support for Carter, saying that this is what he deserves. But no one, absolutely no one, came to Jayden's aid. Finally, after the club had slammed into the boy's side one last time with a dull thud, Carter stopped. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving with the effort. Jayden lay before him, broken like a doll, his body no longer responding to his efforts to escape. He felt nothing, not his legs, not the pain, only a deep, empty darkness was slowly filling his mind. "Now you know how you should act when you see an officer," Carter said, his voice hoarse and quiet, as if even he was tired of his own rage. But Jayden couldn't answer anymore. His consciousness was slowly leaving his body, and the world around him was becoming more and more distant and unreal. All he felt now was emptiness. Jayden lay on the cold asphalt, his gaze turned to the empty, bright sky, but he could no longer see it. Everything around him began to lose its outline. The sounds of the street faded, as if someone had muted the volume of reality. The pain that moments ago had burned his body from the inside suddenly became distant, as if dissolving into an endless darkness that engulfed his consciousness. Every breath felt infinitely heavier, as if the air was getting thicker and weighing a ton. Jayden tried to breathe, but it felt like an unbearable effort. Dark spots began to appear in front of his eyes, filling his vision until they consumed him completely. He couldn't feel anything anymore. Darkness fell upon him suddenly. Thoughts raced through his head, chaotic and incoherent. He tried to remember how he had ended up here. Why was all this happening to him? He had just been walking to school, and now he was lying on the ground, unable to move, his body refusing to obey. Why? Flashed through his mind. He didn't know the answer, but everything inside him screamed at the injustice. Silence. In that absolute silence, fragments of memories flashed before him. His mother's face, her smile, the way she always told him, "Be careful." He remembered his best friend, Elijah, playing basketball in the yard, enjoying the simple things. It all seemed so distant now, like it was someone else's life. And now? What now? Suddenly, his consciousness cracked and he was torn apart by a new surge of pain, right in the middle of his back, as if thousands of hot needles had pierced his spine. The darkness that had almost swallowed him up suddenly retreated, revealing the terrible reality he was in. No! His inner scream echoed in the emptiness of his mind, but no one heard it. He felt the cold fingers of terror wrap around his body again. He tried to move his legs, but they wouldn't obey. Another try, another. Nothing. Numbness pierced him like a dagger. His legs seemed to disappear, as if they were no longer there. His lower back ached, but not as much as this inner emptiness. "My legs," flashed through his mind. He tried to move them again and again, but to no avail. Panic spread through his body, turning into a real nightmare. He heard the policeman's voice again, but this time it seemed to come from afar, as if through a thick wall. "Damn it, the kid's not pretending anymore," Carter muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Damn it, he hit me too hard." Carter stood over Jayden, looking down at his still body. A hint of doubt flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by indifference. He knew he had gone too far, but inside he was consumed by the habit of violence, by the idea that people like Jayden did not deserve mercy. To Carter, this was just another job, dirty, unpleasant, but necessary. "Get up, can you hear me?" he shouted again, but Jayden's body didn't respond. Jayden heard the voice, but he couldn't respond. Panic was raging inside him, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs were frozen. It felt as if someone had simply erased a part of his body, rendering him helpless. It was worse than any pain, worse than any blow. It was the feeling of utter helplessness. "I can't," Jayden breathed out quietly, but the words came out so weak that no one heard them. Officer Carter frowned, his face going slightly pale. He glanced around, finally noticing the people who had already started filming the scene on their phones. The sight made him frown even more, and he took a step back, as if unsure of what to do next. "Can you hear me?" he called again, less confidently, but Jayden didn't move. Carter looked down at his club, still shiny from the last blow. He froze for a moment, realizing the gravity of the situation. He knew he had hit too hard, and it could have been a fatal mistake. He couldn't let the boy get hurt, or worse. "Shit," Carter whispered, his eyes darting around to see who could see. He could see the crowd growing. People weren't going to interfere, but their eyes were asking, "What have you done?" Jayden felt the darkness creeping in again. It was gentler this time, taking him away from the pain, and he was ready to give into it, to run into that sweet darkness where there was no fear or pain. "Help," he whispered quietly, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the street. And with his last heavy breath, his mind plunged into the bottomless darkness that had finally swallowed him up. The soft hum of the hospital room was the only sound that reached Jayden's consciousness. Somewhere nearby, the machine monitoring his heartbeat was beeping softly. The boy opened his eyes, his gaze slowly focusing on the white ceiling. His eyelids felt heavy, as if he was waking from the deepest sleep. His entire body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The pain returned with his consciousness, but it was different, dulled and diluted by drugs. He slowly looked up and saw an force sticking out of his arm. Lines of tubes connected him to machines that clicked and beeped. He was in a hospital, but why? His thoughts were foggy and his head was filled with an unbearable noise. What had happened? And then he remembered. The blow of the baton, the screams, the cold asphalt, the paralyzing feeling of terror when he could no longer move his legs. His heart began to beat faster and panic washed over him. He tried to move, but his legs did not respond again. "No, no," Jayden muttered quietly, his breathing quickening. He tried again in desperation, but to no avail. There was no pain or tingling in his legs, only emptiness. Tears came to his eyes, and fear took hold of him completely. At that moment, the door to the room quietly opened and his mother, Mrs. Harris, walked into the room. Her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had spent hours crying. Her face was sad, but she tried to hold on, as if trying to show her son a strength that she herself did not have at that moment. A doctor in a white coat followed her, a tall man with a serious expression. When she saw that Jayden was awake, her lips twitched. "Jayden," her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid of breaking down with these words. "Mom, what's going on?" he croaked, feeling a lump in his throat. "Why can't I move?" Her face was contorted with pain. She tried to hide her emotions, but Jayden saw everything. She came closer, sat on the edge of his bed and gently took his hand. His mother was silent for a long time, as if gathering her courage to say these terrible words that would now tear his world apart. "Mom, tell me," he repeated, feeling fear grip his mind. "What happened to me? Why can't I move my legs?" The doctor standing behind her stepped forward, his face grim, like a man accustomed to delivering bad news. He spoke first, though guardedly. "Jayden, your mother wants you to know the truth. You suffered a serious spinal injury. We did everything we could, but," he paused for a moment, as if choosing his words, "your spine was severely damaged in the lumbar region. We can't restore it completely." The doctor's words echoed in Jayden's head, but he couldn't understand them. He didn't want to understand them. It was impossible. "What?" he croaked, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Injury? But I'll be fine, right? I'll be able to walk again?" Mrs. Harris couldn't take it anymore. Tears started streaming down her cheeks and she leaned closer to her son, her hands shaking as she tried to hug him. "I'm sorry, baby." Her voice was almost inaudible, trembling and full of despair. "Forgive me." "Mom, no, no. Tell me it's not true," Jayden screamed, his cry filled with horror and pain. "Mom, tell me it's not true." But she didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand, covering her face with her other hand, trying to hide her tears, but her shoulders were shaking traitorously. The doctor, feeling he needed to intervene, continued, Jayden, we know this is hard to accept. The damage is too severe. We've done everything we can, but the nerve endings won't heal. That means, his voice was getting quieter, as if he didn't want to say the words, you won't be able to walk again. The words hit Jayden like a truck. His head started buzzing and everything around him became blurry. Not able to walk? The thought was so monstrous that he couldn't believe it. Never. How was that possible? He was an ordinary boy. Loved to run, play basketball, go to school. How could this all end? No, he screamed, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. It's not true. You're lying. I'll be able to walk. You have to cure me. Please cure me. He desperately grabbed his mother's hand, as if he hoped that her touch could bring his legs back to life. But nothing happened. Everything remained the same. Mom, do something. His voice was full of pleading. Tell them to do something. Mrs. Harris tried to comfort him, sobbing, but nothing worked. At that moment, his life was falling apart. He felt like the world around him was crumbling into dust. All his dreams and future were crumbling before his eyes. Why did this happen to me? He screamed, his cry full of pain, anger and despair. Why did he do this? I didn't do anything. The mother could not answer. She could only be there, squeezing the hand of her son, immersed in the hell of his own awareness. The doctor stepped back, leaving the mother and son in this hell, and quietly left the room. Silence filled the space again, but now it was the silence of absolute desolation. The Harris home was filled with oppressive darkness, as if the space itself had absorbed the pain and grief, filling the air with a still, heavy breath. There was no joy in this house anymore, only bitterness, fear, and an all-consuming silence that cut into hearts like a sharp knife. After Jayden was released from the hospital, their lives were never the same. The boy's room now contained a wheelchair, replacing his childhood toys and basketball. This symbol of his new reality was a painful reminder of what had happened. Every movement, every breath was saturated with the weight of what the police officer had done to their child. The anger grew with each passing day. Mrs. Harris sat in the living room, staring at the phone. Her eyes were red from crying and sleepless nights. The doctor's words kept playing in her head. He'll never walk again. It was like a death sentence for their family, because everything had changed. Every day she heard her son crying at night, and her heart was breaking with pain. There were no more familiar sounds of Jayden's footsteps in the house. No more joyful laughter. Now there was only one thing: silence. The husband, Mr. Harris, tried to hold on, but inside him, there was rage. He tried to suppress it, but it ate away at him from the inside, making every day a torture. He saw his son in a wheelchair, his eyes without life, and he couldn't take it. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. We must do something, he said loudly, slamming his fist on the table. The dishes shook from the blow, and his wife flinched at his outburst. Daniel, please. Mrs. Harris spoke quietly, but there was the same pain in her voice. We're trying, but what can we do? What can we do? He jumped up from his chair, his eyes blazing with anger. Do you really want to just sit and watch our son suffer? Do you want this cop to just get away with it? He ruined Jayden's life. Our boy will never walk again. Her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. It was Thomas Carter. His voice was full of contempt. That bastard is still at large. He's not even in custody. They're trying to cover it up. Sandra, do you understand that? The police are covering up for their own man. Daniel, she grabbed his hand, trying to calm him down, but he abruptly pulled her hand away, unable to hold back any longer. No, stop putting up with this, he growled. I will not let this bastard get away with it. I will file a complaint. I will get justice. He must pay for what he did. The silence hung in the air like a heavy cloud about to burst. Mrs. Harris breathed heavily, feeling her own anger rising. Her husband was right. The system was trying to protect Carter. They had already seen it when they had asked the police to investigate. Their statement had been met with cold indifference. The day after Jayden was released from hospital, they went to the police station. Mrs. Harris remembers every detail of that meeting, the officers at their desks, the cold stares, the formal responses. She felt like they already knew no one was going to help. Ma'am, your son resisted, one of the officers said. Looking down at the papers, the policeman acted in accordance with instructions. The child resisted? There was bewilderment in her voice, bordering on hysteria. He's only 12. He was going to school. How could he resist? The officer looked at her, but there was no compassion in his gaze, only the cold, indifferent severity of the law. To them, this was just another case that needed to be closed. "We will conduct an internal investigation," the officer replied dryly, "but at this time, we have no reason to believe that Officer Carter abused his authority." It was a blow to the face. It was as if the entire system that was supposed to protect them had turned its back on them. From that day on, the family realized that they were alone against a justice machine that was working for its own. "I won't let them hide this," Daniel said furiously, his face contorted with anger. "We'll get a lawyer. We'll go to court. We'll make a fuss if we have to." Mrs. Harris knew they were right. They couldn't just sit back and let their son be destroyed. Her heart was breaking for Jayden, but there was also an anger inside her that she had suppressed for too long. They would fight. The story of Jayden, a 12-year-old boy left disabled after a brutal police attack, began to spread like wildfire across the city. Everyone who heard about the incident was shocked and incredulous that such a thing could happen to a child who was simply walking to school. Local news channels began covering the incident, showing pictures of Jayden before and after the attack. His bright smile, previously radiating life and energy, was now gone, replaced by the empty stare of a child whose future had been stolen. People started talking about it in the streets, and anger quickly spread among residents. Social media exploded as videos from news reports were shared by thousands of users. Hashtags like #JusticeForJayden and #StopPoliceViolence began trending. Outraged posts and comments discussed police brutality and the system's indifference. For many, this wasn't just Jayden's case, it was a symbol of all the injustice they had felt for a long time. The public outcry began to grow. "Have you heard about this guy?" People were talking in cafes, on buses, on the streets. "A policeman hit him, broke his spine. He's only 12. How is this even possible?" Others responded, shaking their heads in disbelief. "He's a child. Why is this happening in our city? Why do they think they can just do this and get away with it?" Reporters, microphones, cameras began to flock to the Harris family home, all eager to learn the details of the story. As he watched them, Mr. Harris felt his anger rise. He didn't want to turn his son's tragedy into a spectacle, but he knew that without public attention, the story could simply be hushed up. He looked at his wife, and in her eyes he saw the same feelings: pain, fear, but also determination to fight. "We have to make a statement," he said, squeezing her hand. "People need to know the truth. They need to see what happened to our son." Mrs. Harris nodded, holding back tears. It broke her heart every time she saw Jayden in his wheelchair, his eyes no longer holding the sparkle of life that once filled them. She knew she couldn't remain silent. The next day, standing before a crowd of reporters, Mr. and Mrs. Harris made their statement. Jayden was nearby, sitting in a wheelchair, his eyes far away, as if he could no longer hear or see what was happening. His mother stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders, trying to support him. "Our son was a victim not just of brutality, but of the systemic violence that continues in this country," Mr. Harris began, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "He did nothing to deserve this, but he was so damaged that he will never walk again. That police officer, Thomas Carter, is still at large, and our son is confined to a wheelchair. This should not be okay. We demand justice." His words echoed through the city streets. The next morning, photos of the Harris family appeared on front pages, news bulletins, and smartphone screens across the city. The protests began. People could not remain silent. Crowds of people gathered at the police station where Thomas Carter worked and began chanting slogans: "Justice for Jayden, enough police violence, Carter must answer." Young people, students, activists, mothers with children, they all stood side by side, demanding justice. But the anger wasn't limited to words. Soon, the peaceful protests began to escalate into something more sinister. When police tried to disperse the protesters, the crowd responded by shouting and throwing rocks. There was desperation in the protesters' eyes, fueled by years of pent-up hatred and frustration. They couldn't take this injustice any longer. One of the protesters, a tall man holding a placard, leaned toward the journalist and said, "It's not just about Jayden. We're all tired of this. Every day we see police officers abuse their power, and no one stops them." His voice shook with rage. "But now enough. If they think they can just beat our children, we're going to show them they're wrong." In the evening, A wave of violence engulfed the city streets. Clashes with the police began. Cars were overturned and set on fire. Protesters, enraged by the inaction of the authorities, began to smash shop windows, set trash cans on fire and throw Molotov cocktails towards police cordons. The police responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. The city streets turned into a battlefield. "They made us do this," one protester shouted, his face streaked with tears and gas smoke. "They spat on our son." Scenes of chaos filled the news, and the entire city was caught up in this explosive cocktail of rage and injustice. Jayden, confined to his wheelchair, was unable to go outside, but his face became a symbol of the fight. Local artists began painting his portraits on the walls of buildings, turning Jayden into a poster child for police brutality. At one such moment, Mrs. Harris sat by the window of their house and looked out onto the street, at the crowds of people with placards, and heard the cries of protest. She understood that the world they had lived in before had disappeared forever. A mixture of anger, fear, and hopelessness boiled inside her. They could no longer return to their previous lives. Meanwhile, police officers were gathering around Officer Carter's home, protecting him from the wrath of the crowd. Residents were demanding his arrest, but he remained free, hidden behind the shield of the system that protected him. The violence in the city continued, and it seemed that every day, Jayden became a new symbol of the fight for justice, a symbol that his parents believed would change the world, but at too high a cost. The trial of Officer Thomas Carter began in an atmosphere of deep disbelief and tension. The Harris family already knew the odds were stacked against them. The system had long since learned to protect its own. Carter, a white, longtime cop who was considered a role model for other officers, was unmoved. His lawyers argued that he had acted within the law of that day and that the incident had been an escalation out of control. But to the Harris family, especially Daniel, it felt like a slap in the face. The courtroom was full. In the front row, facing justice, sat Daniel and Sandra Harris. Sandra had her hand on Jayden's wheelchair, who was looking at the floor, avoiding the gaze of anyone around him. He was there as a witness, as a victim, but in the eyes of the law enforcement officers and their defense attorneys, as an object they intended to use to prove their case. The police attorneys were sharks, professional, dispassionate, with smiles that seemed icy. "First of all, my client acted strictly according to protocol," Carter's lawyer, a large man with graying temples, began as he stood before the court. "This was a difficult situation. We're talking about a high-crime neighborhood." When the officer encountered Jayden Harris's suspicious behavior, he acted on his instincts. Mrs. Harris, hearing these words, squeezed her son's hand tighter. Her eyes filled with tears, but she suppressed them. Now was not the time for tears. She looked at her husband and saw how his fists were clenched. His face was tense, as if he was struggling to contain the rage that had been bubbling inside him since the day their son was hit in the street. "That child was no threat," she cried, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to make several people in the room turn around. The Harris family's attorney, a civil rights lawyer, stood up to present his side. "We are talking about a 12-year-old child. This boy, on his way to school, did nothing wrong. He was beaten by an officer for no reason, and that attack left him disabled for life. Officer Carter committed excessive violence that was unjustifiable." The room began to whisper, and the judge banged his gavel, calling for order. The evidence was overwhelming, but the system was stronger. When it came to Jayden himself, his testimony was wrenching. He was called to the witness stand, and the entire room fell silent. The boy, who could barely sit in his wheelchair because of severe back pain, looked broken. He was consumed by fear and depression. Talking about that day was like reliving the nightmare all over again. "Tell me what happened this morning when you met Officer Carter," Harris's attorney asked, his voice soft but firm. Jayden looked down. The room was tensely silent, everyone waiting for his words. "I was just walking to school," he began quietly, his voice shaking. "I saw him, the policeman. He started yelling at me, said I looked suspicious. I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't resist. I tried to explain to him that I was just late for class, and then he came up to me, and hit me with his baton." "Why do you think he hit you?" the lawyer asked. "I don't know." Jayden paused, remembering that moment. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just scared." The courtroom gasped as Carter's attorney stood for cross-examination. "Jayden, you said the officer thought you were suspicious. Tell me, were you nervous at the time? Did you start moving suddenly, perhaps? The boy frowned, not knowing how to answer. No, I just wanted to go to school. Or maybe you did something that might have seemed dangerous to the officer. Maybe you raised your hands or moved quickly. No, I was just standing. His voice was shaking more and more. He felt cornered. The lawyer tried to shift the blame onto the child, using every detail to paint Carter as an innocent victim of the situation. It was a typical tactic to make the victim feel guilty, even if she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's enough, Harris's lawyer intervened, but the judge allowed them to continue. In the streets, meanwhile, the protests continued. A group of activists began picketing outside the courthouse, demanding Carter's arrest. Posters with Jayden's face, now a symbol of their struggle, filled the area. It was as if his family's cries of pain were echoing in these angry, unforgiving people. Inside the court, the real battle was going on. The officer's lawyers tried to portray him as a hero who was just doing his job. They emphasized over and over that Jayden could have been a potential threat. They talked about his movements, the area where it happened, hinted at crime in that part of town, playing on stereotypes and fears. Officer Carter never abused his authority, the attorney said, his voice thick with confidence. He operated in an environment where split-second decisions are made every day. He was faced with danger that day. He didn't know who he was facing. He didn't know it was a child, and he acted according to protocol. Those words were a knife in the heart for the Harris family. The system that was supposed to protect them was now building iron walls of protection around Carter. But the fight didn't end in the courtroom. In the media, on the streets, in every corner of the city, people continued to be outraged. Reports filled screens. People demanded justice, discussed Jayden's case, talked about the police violence that affected not only him but countless others whose stories had not received such public attention. And at that moment, Jayden, sitting on the witness stand, finally looked up and looked straight at the judge. "I didn't mean anything bad," he said quietly but confidently. "I just wanted to get to school." The wait for the verdict lasted an eternity. The courtroom was deathly silent, every sound deafening. The Harris family sat in the front row, across from the judge. Jayden, still silent in his wheelchair, avoided all eyes directed at him. The wait was excruciating, each moment bringing hope and fear, mixing them into one painful cocktail. The judge began to read the verdict, and each word cut through the air like a knife. "Officer Thomas Carter, the charges against you for using excessive force resulting in injury to 12-year-old Jayden Harris have been reviewed. After careful consideration of the evidence presented by both parties, the court has concluded." The Harris family's hearts sank. This was the moment when fate would either restore justice or strike again. That Officer Carter acted within his authority and did not exceed it. His actions were justified under the circumstances of that day. Verdict: not guilty. Officer Carter is cleared of all charges. A loud sigh echoed through the room, as if someone had let the air out of hundreds of lungs in one go. There was a moment of paralyzing silence, which immediately exploded into screams and indignation. Sandra Harris screamed, her face contorted with pain and rage. "This can't be true!" She squeezed Jayden's hands, who still couldn't believe what she was hearing. "They can't just do this. He killed our son." Daniel, who had been silent throughout the entire process, suddenly jumped to his feet, his eyes blazing with rage. He walked straight toward Officer Carter, who was already preparing to leave the room with his head held high. "You ruined his life," Daniel screamed, his voice cutting through the air. "You killed my son, and you won't pay for it." The police in the courtroom immediately rushed to restrain him, but Daniel did not give in. He did not care about the law, the consequences. His son could no longer walk, and the man who did this was calmly walking away. "He doesn't deserve this," Daniel continued to scream, his voice breaking with pain. "You will pay for this." As he was led out of the courtroom, the protesters outside knew the verdict. The news spread through the city that Officer Carter had been acquitted. The wave of indignation reached its peak. People who had been waiting for justice now realized that the system had betrayed them again. The powerless law that was supposed to protect Jayden was a puppet in the hands of those who held power. The crowds outside the courthouse quickly spiraled out of control. Screams began. The sounds of glass shattering echoed through the streets. People overturned cars, set trash cans on fire. The look in every protester's eyes expressed the despair and anger that had been simmering inside them for years. "There is no justice," A young woman shouted with a placard in her hands. Our children are being killed, and the murderers are getting away with it. We will not tolerate this any longer. The crowd chanted her words, like an ancient roar of battle echoing through the streets of the city. The protests began to escalate into full-scale riots. The police who surrounded the courthouse could not contain the onslaught of angry people. Clashes began. People threw rocks, bottles, anything they could get their hands on at the police. In response, the police began using tear gas and batons. "You are protecting murderers," people shouted, covering their faces with scarves and t-shirts, trying to escape the acrid smoke. One of the protesters, a tall man in a black sweatshirt, waved his fists as he approached the officers standing in the cordon. "Why are you defending him? He's a child." And this bastard walked out of court as a hero. The police did not respond. Their faces were covered with masks, and their eyes were full of indifference. For them, this was just another task, to suppress unrest. Meanwhile, the Harris family left the courthouse in tears and anger. Sandra was barely able to stand, supported by friends. Jayden was gloomy and dejected, his head bowed, his eyes refusing to look at the world around him. "We won't stop," Sandra whispered, her voice shaking with anger. "They can't just walk away from this. They'll pay. They'll all pay." Daniel, who had calmed down, walked up to his wife and son. There was the same anger in his eyes, but now it burned with a cold flame. It wasn't just anger, it was determination to fight to the end. "We can't trust this system anymore," he said, looking at Jayden. "They sold us out." The next day, news reports showed images of trashed streets, burning cars, and scenes of violence that had gripped the city since the verdict. Pundits and politicians argued over whether the protesters or the police were to blame, but to the Harris family, it didn't matter. All they saw was how the system had betrayed them. For Jayden, the world had become gray and alien. His life no longer resembled what he had known before that day. After the trial, after those words that had finally destroyed his hope for justice, something had broken inside him. He no longer felt human, his thoughts constantly returning to the moment when Officer Carter's baton had crashed down on his back, depriving him of the most precious thing, the freedom to move. Every morning was a struggle. He woke up in his small room, the walls of which now felt like a prison cell. His bed was by the window, but he could no longer look out onto the street as he once had. He now saw the world through bars of pain and despair. His legs, the ones that had once run across the schoolyard, the ones that couldn't stay in place during joyful moments, were now useless. Little Jayden, who had loved to play football, was dead. In his place was a boy in a wheelchair who no longer knew who he was. "Mom, I don't want to get up," he muttered one morning when Sandra came into his room to help him start the day. Her heart broke every time she saw her son in such a state. Jayden was no longer himself. He barely spoke. He didn't laugh. His eyes were empty, like a man who had seen too much grief for his age. "Jayden, you have to. You need to eat, and you have therapy today," Sandra reminded softly, but there was pain in her voice. Therapy. Every time the word was mentioned, it was like a joke to Jayden. These endless attempts to give him back some form of normality were torture. Doctors and physical therapists told him that he had to fight, that there was still a chance to regain some mobility, but every session was torture. His body refused to obey, and every movement caused sharp, unbearable pain. During physical therapy, Jayden often just sat there in silence. The therapist, Josh, a young man with kind eyes, tried to encourage him. "Come on, Jayden, you can do it. Today we're going to try to lift your legs higher. It won't be easy, but you've come a long way." But to Jayden, it sounded like empty words. He no longer believed in the future. "What's the point?" he said to Josh one day, expressing his true feelings for the first time. "I'll never walk. It's pointless." The therapist paused for a moment, realizing that the boy was finally opening up, but what he heard shook him to the core. "Jayden," Josh began carefully, trying to find the right words, "I know this is hard for you. No one said it would be easy, but life goes on, and you can learn to live differently. You're strong. I can see that." "Strong?" Jayden laughed, but his laugh was cold and bitter. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I'll never be able to play with my friends again. I can't even go to school like I used to. How will I ever live?" The words came out with such pain that Josh paused for a moment. He knew that none of the standard speeches about fighting and fortitude would help. For Jayden, every attempt to recover seemed like a mockery, and every day was filled with a fight not for life, but for the opportunity to even feel alive. Sandra and Daniel watched their son retreat deeper into himself. Depression settled over Jayden like a thick blanket. He felt like the world had lost its fairness since the jury acquitted Carter. The pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The injury hadn't just robbed him of the ability to walk, it had stolen his future. "He doesn't talk to us anymore, Daniel," Sandra told her husband one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "I don't recognize him anymore. He's not our son." Daniel frowned, his face stony but rage seething inside him. "I can't blame him, Sandra. How can he live with that bastard walking free? We're all prisoners of this system. But this isn't the end. We'll find a way to get justice." But justice seemed out of reach, like a mirage in the desert. Every day when Jayden woke up, his world was getting smaller and smaller. He even started avoiding his old friends. The kids from school came to visit him, but he couldn't stand their pity. He didn't want to see them standing in front of him, trying to cheer him up, but with sadness in their eyes. "Hey, Jayden, we're playing basketball this weekend. Maybe you'd like to come and watch?" suggested one of his friends, Ricky, nervously fiddling with his cap. "What? Sit and watch you run?" Jayden replied coldly. "No, thanks." Ricky fell silent, unsure of what to say. In that moment, he realized that their friend as they knew him no longer existed. Months passed. The pain from the physical injury still gnawed at Jayden, but the emotional pain was worse. He no longer saw any point in living. Several times, he even considered ending his suffering. One night, after his parents were asleep, he sat in his room, staring at the bottle of painkillers the nurse had left behind. There was a battle going on inside him. He was tired. But suddenly, he heard his mother's voice from the other room, crying softly. Her pain and despair reminded him that he was not alone. Even though his world had collapsed, he still mattered to those who loved him.